Hi everyone, welcome to this session. It's organized by the Bank of England. It's on the role of inflation expectations. We have 4 presentations coming up, and Ivan will kick off the session. So we'll do 25 minutes and then of presentation and allow for another 5 minutes of questions in the end. Thanks.
Great. Can I check that everything is working? Everything can hear me? Everyone can hear me? Great. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. Hope you had a good lunch. So, as the slide suggests, I'm going to present some evidence on inflation expectations and inflation uncertainty in the decision maker panel today. So this isn't going to be a presentation of a single research project, but it's going to be, I'm going to talk a little bit about the decision maker panel, and in particular how we measure inflation expectations and inflation uncertainty. Then I'm going to give sort of an overview of the key trends that we've seen over the past couple of years regarding expectations and uncertainty. And then I'm going to weave in a few results that we've gotten from several different research projects on this theme. Just to mention, this is joint work with a very large and fantastic team of people from the Bank of England, also the University of Nottingham and Stanford University. Some of these people are in the room today. And of course, the usual disclaimer applies. So let me just get started then. As a way of introduction, inflation expectations are, of course, an important driver of economic decision making. This is for consumption behavior, household spending, and also for firm pricing decisions. And indeed, actually, some of the other sessions, some of the other presentations in this session are going to speak very much to these topics as well. And because of their importance, accurate measures of inflation expectations and uncertainty surrounding these forecasts are crucial. And there's a variety of different ways of going about measuring expectations. We can have structural models and build structural models to inform forecasts. We can use financial markets data, and also we can use survey data. We can use household surveys like the inflation attitude survey that's going to also feature in some of the other presentations you'll see. We can use firm level data from the decision maker panel, and of course there's also surveys of professional forecasters. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about new evidence on short-term inflation expectations and firm level inflation uncertainty using the decision maker panel. And I'm going to focus on two different types of expectations, firms' own price expectations and also their CPI expectations, sort of aggregate inflation expectations. And let me give you a brief summary of some of the main findings that I'm going to discuss today. The first one is that, the expectations that we capture with the decision maker panel are fairly high quality. Firms on average have a really good sense about their price growth in the year ahead. Because this is a panel, we can compare firms' expectations with what the realized price growth is a year later following their expectations. And when we focus on these expectations, what the data show is that firms currently expect price growth to remain elevated in the year ahead, so from now to 12 months from now, although at lower rates compared with what we've seen over the past 12 months. And these average inflation expectations, going on to the third point, these average inflation expectations actually hide quite a bit of heterogeneity. And when we look a bit deeper across different firms, we see that expectations have become highly dispersed and positively skewed across firms in 2022 and now in 2023. And we also see that average firm-level inflation uncertainty remains near historically high levels in 2023. Following on to the fourth point, we try to dig in a little bit into the different drivers of firms' inflation expectations. And what we see that there are multiple factors influencing their year-ahead own price expectations, including developments in the labor market, increases in minimum wages, of course, energy prices, and other input costs. And then finally, putting aside firms' own price expectations, we can also look at CPI expectations in the DMP. And what we see is that 1 year and 3 year ahead CPI expectations are also elevated, over the past year. And here we see that energy prices have been the main factor influencing firms' year-ahead CPI expectations. So the first kind of section of the presentation, I'm going to present about some information about the decision maker panel in case you're not familiar with it, and also to help you understand how we measure inflation expectations in the survey. So the decision maker panel is a monthly online survey of UK businesses, and it's completed by chief financial officers, finance directors, and CEOs of firms across the UK. It was started in late 2016 following the Brexit referendum, and it's jointly organized by the Bank of England, the University of Nottingham, and Stanford University. We have a fairly high response rate of between 2,500 and 3,000 firms each month. And in terms of content, firms are asked about the recent developments across a number of different dimensions, such as their sales, their prices, their employment, their capital expenditure, and they're also asked about their year-ahead expectations for these variables. And when we ask firms about their year-ahead expectations, an important feature of the survey is that we ask firms to provide a 5-point distribution for year-ahead expectations, rather than just a point estimate. And what that allows us is a lot more, to do a lot more with these expectations, to analyze not only the mean expectation, but also the higher moments of expectations at the firm level. And that's going to be important for these measures of firm inflation uncertainty that I'm going to talk about. The DMPA has been used to study multiple important policy issues since it was founded, including Brexit, COVID-19, and the Russia-Ukraine war, and of course the surge in inflation. And finally, just as a sort of to advertise, the data are also now available in the ONS Secure Research Service. So if you're interested, you're more than welcome to apply and with a research proposal in order to gain access to it. And now I wanted to zoom in for a little bit and talk to you about how in particular we measure firm inflation expectations in the DMP. So as I've already sort of mentioned, there are kind of two sets of expectations that we capture. The first is about firms' expectations for their own prices in the year ahead, and this is a long-running series we've been asking about since 2016. And the format of these questions, and I'll show you a screenshot on the next slide, is that firms are asked to provide 5 scenarios about their expected price growth in the year ahead, and then to assign probabilities to each of these 5 scenarios. And I just want to emphasize again that this survey covers for all firms, a sample of all firms in the economy, not just consumer-facing firms. And we use a kind of a rotating panel structure where the same firm is asked about price expectations every 3 months. So that's firms' own price expectations. Now the second type of expectations that we ask about is about aggregate CPI expectations and current perceptions. We have a shorter time series for these questions. They were introduced in May of last year. And we ask firms to provide point estimates of current CPI perceptions as well as their 1-year and 3-year ahead CPI expectations. And the same kind of rotating panel structure applies. So this is a screenshot about firms' expected price growth. As you can see on the left side is the first question, where firms provide 5 scenarios: the lowest, low, middle, high, and highest. And then on the right-hand side, they assign probabilities to each of these 5 scenarios that they've specified. And in contrast, this is what the question on CPI perceptions and inflation expectations look like. So we ask them for point estimates of these measures. Now, a very reasonable question that you may be asking is how accurate are these expectations that firms are making? Are they just putting numbers in the survey just to get to the next question, or do these expectations actually reflect what they think is going to happen? And so what we've done here is we've plotted on the horizontal axis firms' expected price inflation a year ago, and then on the vertical axis is the realizations for those firms a year later for price growth. And as you can see, these line up quite well along the 45-degree line, suggesting that on average, firms have a pretty good sense about their own price growth in the year ahead. And you can kind of see a similar, very close link when you look at expectations for sales and employment and capital expenditure. I haven't shown that here just to save time. But in general, firms' expectations are quite accurate on average. We can also do something similar when you look at CPI with our data on CPI perceptions and expectations. And so what I'm showing here is CPI inflation rates over the past year, since March of 2023, and also with average CPI perceptions, current CPI perceptions across firms. And as you can see again here, firms tend to be quite attentive on average about CPI inflation trends, and perception errors tend to be small. So that was kind of a brief summary of the DMP and how we measure inflation expectations, and also trying to provide some sanity checks about the quality of the data that we collect. So now I'm going to try to give you also a brief summary of inflation expectations and what's been happening in the data over the past few years. I have a slide with text here, but that kind of summarizes the main figures that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to skip the text and go straight to the figures. So this first figure is showing you the trends in firms' realized price growth. That's the green line, and their expectations per year ahead on price growth, which is the orange line. And as you can see, what has happened, if we look at the orange line, in the beginning of the pandemic and the start of 2020, you see that inflation expectations dipped a little bit from their sort of pre-pandemic levels. But then since kind of mid-2020, they increased pretty much in a straight line with few deviations. And expectations started to increase, indeed, before realized price growth started to increase. And for a while, until sort of mid-2022, these two lines kind of increased in tandem. But what's happened is inflation expectations, firms' inflation expectations have reached a peak around September, in the second half of 2022, and since then have started to come down a bit. And what this suggests is that although firm price growth remains elevated over the past year, firms expect their price growth to slow down in the year ahead, although the rates remain quite high. And so in the 3 months to April, for example, firms expected their prices to increase by a further kind of 5.5% over the year ahead. But there is a gap between what has happened in the past year and what firms expect in the year ahead. Now, the second thing that I also mentioned previously is that these kind of average trends across all firms hide quite a lot of heterogeneity, and that reflects the kind of environment that we're living with a lot of different shocks hitting firms, including firstly the pandemic shock, then the energy price shock, and then we also have related labor recruitment difficulties and supply disruptions, and that's really reflected in the distribution of expectations across firms. So what this chart is showing you is kind of what it's showing you is the evolution of firms' expectations across different percentiles of the distribution. And so what you can see is that everything was going quite, in the pre-pandemic period, everything was quite stable. All these percentiles were moving kind of along the same margins, but the dispersion across firms has increased quite significantly. And indeed, the expectations at the top end of the distribution have increased quite significantly, which is making the distribution of expectations very positively skewed across firms. So there's an increasing heterogeneity across firms in their expectations. Next, I wanted to briefly talk about CPI expectations. And first of all, I wanted to emphasize again that although price growth and CPI are related concepts, they are quite distinct. So again, the DMP covers a sample of all firms in in the economy, not just consumer-facing firms. And also the way that these measures are constructed is different in the sense that we weight these aggregate measures from the DMP by employment and industry shares, whereas CPI data is weighted by the weights in the consumption basket across different prices. But what we see is that CPI expectations, both 1 year and 3 year ahead, are also elevated across firms in the DMP. They also reached a peak around September 2022 of last year. And that's the orange and the blue line for 1 year and 3 years ahead, and have since come down a bit, but remain elevated across firms. And the figure on the right suggests that there's a very strong positive relationship between firms' 1 year and 3 year ahead expectations. And again, on this heterogeneity point, CPI expectations are also quite dispersed across firms, suggesting that there is quite a lot of disagreement across firms about what's going to happen to CPI inflation in the year ahead. As you can see, starting from May to September, the distribution of CPI expectations increased quite dramatically, especially for year ahead expectations. But going back to April now, it has come down quite a bit and become more condensed, although still quite dispersed across firms. So with that said, I want to sort of switch gears a little bit. So I've given a summary of kind of the key trends in inflation expectations we see in the DMP. And now I want to focus on something a little bit more novel that we're able to do with the survey data. And that's look at firm-level inflation uncertainty. And that's something that we can look at precisely because we have these kind of five-point distributional questions, which allow us to look at not only the average expectations, but also the distributions at the firm level. And so I'm going to show you a few findings from a paper we have forthcoming in the AEA papers and proceedings, which also summarize our findings on firm inflation uncertainty. So again, I'm going to skip the slide with the text and just go on straight to the figures. So this figure is showing you the trends comparing two measures of firm level uncertainty. You have the uncertainty about nominal sales, which is the dashed line, and you have uncertainty about future price growth, which is the maroon line. And you see a very, very different evolution across these two measures since the start of the pandemic. And these are normalized to kind of the average level in 2019. What you see when you look at nominal sales uncertainty is that it increased dramatically relative to pre-pandemic levels in the start of the pandemic. And of course, that's related to the lockdowns and firm closures. And firms were forced to close down during the early stages of the pandemic. And then since then, nominal sales uncertainty has started to decline. And really, in the latest months, it's almost back to pre-pandemic levels. In contrast, uncertainty about prices has evolved quite differently. In the beginning of the pandemic, it increased only, it also increased quite a bit, but much less than sales uncertainty. And then since then, it has increased quite dramatically, and it's kind of peaked in the second half of 2022. Since then, we've seen it come down a little bit, but it's still near historically high levels. And I'm not going to show this now, but again, when we look at 5 minutes, good. When we look at these are kind of, again, average measures across all firms, but there is, again, quite substantial heterogeneity across firms in their firm level expectations. We see that over the past year, smaller firms tend to have higher inflation uncertainty, and also firms in the goods sector tend to have higher inflation uncertainty, maybe related to the types of shocks that they've been experiencing. The second question is also, okay, firms have higher uncertainty, but what does this imply? What are the implications of firms being more uncertain about prices? And we've looked at this in a number of different ways and a number of different relationships. But one pretty robust finding is that firms, when they're more uncertain, they make larger forecast errors. So what this is showing you is expected inflation uncertainty on the vertical axis a year ago, and then on the horizontal axis, it's showing you price forecast errors between the moment the expectations were set and a year later. And so what this V-shaped graph is showing you is that when you have higher inflation uncertainty, that's associated with higher price forecast errors, both on the positive and negative. We've also looked at some other measures of firm performance, such as profit margins and TFP, and we also see some negative correlations there, suggesting that firms with higher uncertainty have lower TFP and lower profit margins. There are different potential explanations. Of course, first of all, these are correlations, and they may suggest something about management practices, or they could also suggest something about firms not being able to allocate inputs efficiently when inflation uncertainty is high. And then the final thing, so that's kind of a quick summary of some of the main findings from our firm inflation uncertainty. And then finally, I wanted to present some findings on the drivers of inflation expectations. That's one of the things I mentioned in the beginning. The first thing to say is that, yes, inflation expectations are high, but also costs for firms have increased quite a lot. And we can look at these relationships in the DMP because we also asked them questions about their expected unit cost growth and expected year-ahead wage growth. And what we see here is, again, really strong positive relationships suggesting that firms who have higher wage expectations, higher unit cost expectations, also experience quite a lot, also have higher expectations for their year-ahead price growth. A second quite interesting finding is that over the past years, aggregate inflation has increased quite a lot. And so what we can do in the DMP is look at how firms' own price expectations respond to these CPI outturns every month. And what we see is that over the past year, when new CPI data is released, firms respond and adjust their own price expectations pretty significantly in response to these CPI outturns. And that's something that we don't see in previous years of the data. So that's kind of one of the research projects we're developing to look at how firms form their inflation expectations. Another approach we've taken to measuring and quantifying the different factors related to inflation expectations and the different drivers is to just ask firms using open-ended text questions. And so we do that for their own price expectations, and we've done it also for their CPI expectations. And so what we see is that when we ask firms about the factors driving own price expectations for the year ahead, there's a number of different factors that appear quite frequently. The most common one is the labor market, developments in the labor market, also costs going up, and of course the energy sector. Whereas if we look at the answers for CPI expectations, we see that energy is by far the dominant factor firms cite when as a key driver of their short-term CPI expectations. So let me conclude. I think I'm almost out of time. So just to summarize, accurate and timely measures of inflation expectations are very important in general for macro research, especially in the current high inflation environment. And the DMP is a monthly survey of firms across the UK, which can be used to track firms' own price expectations and their CPI expectations. And a key feature of the DMP is that it can be used to study not only average firm level expectations, but also higher moments of their expectations, such as uncertainty and skewness about year-ahead own price growth. And the data has been used across several different projects to study firm expectations formation. And as I said, it can also be accessed through the secure research surveys if you're interested. Thank you very much. Ooh, thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. Really interesting paper. The correlation between expected own price changes and expected wage increases, is that very different by the wage share in the cost bill, or is it very different for firms that maybe have a lot of minimum wage workers because those wages are pre-announced? Have you looked at that?
That's a good question. We haven't looked at it yet. We don't ask specifically about whether firms have minimum, what share of workers are on minimum wages and labor costs. We could potentially match it with accounts data on labor costs and see whether that relationship changes. That's a good suggestion. Thanks.
Jeremy Ray, Ness. It was really interesting your chart that showed that now firms' price expectations are being affected by CPI data in the last couple of years and not before. I was wondering whether you had any idea about why that might be the case, as to kind of whether it was a labour market thing or kind of wage negotiations, sort of, what's now meaning that mechanism is different to the past?
Yeah, so we don't have a definitive explanation. There's a couple of different theories. One is that kind of relates to this idea about attention, how much attention firms are paying to inflation, because when inflation was 2%, 2.1%, then it's not so. First of all, it doesn't feature in the news as much as it does now. Now, every month, the ONS releases the CPI data. It's front page news, and which maybe wasn't as much the case before. And so, and also the changes have been much larger over the past year and a half. And so firms are much more aware, and the costs of not reacting to these increases are perhaps larger now than they were before.
Matt Keating, DEFRA. So one of your slides, you had that sales uncertainty was at pre-pandemic levels. I was just thinking maybe consumers have been trading down more and more. Maybe they've got to the point where they can no longer do that. They've, on average, reduced consumption of luxury goods, and maybe they're quite rigid in what they're consuming now. So that's why sales are more guaranteed, as people can no longer cut out more and more, as time has gone on with price increases.
Yeah, no, that's definitely possible. Is that a question? I'm not. Was there a question there?
That's what I was proposing. Is maybe why that was the case, because obviously it's quite different to the price uncertainty, wasn't it? Yeah.
No, that's definitely true. Yeah. It's definitely a good hypothesis.
I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for the presentation. Alan Gray, ONS. Is there any sort of link between the firms that were able to predict the price expectations quite accurately between firms that then performed well? Or is there any sort of link between that?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Is there any sort of link between the firms that were able to predict the price expectations accurately between those firms that then performed well over the next, say, 12 months?
Yeah. So I didn't show it in the. So we do have some correlational evidence here that, for example, firms that have higher inflation uncertainty a year ago, it's correlated with lower profit margins and lower TFP. So these are regressions with some fixed effects. So they're somewhat demanding regressions, but again, it is correlational evidence. We're not sort of saying that there's a causal link here. Although there is some evidence from previous research that suggests that firms' ability to forecast may be related to other measures of firm performance.
Thank you very much.
Oh, great. Thanks everyone.
Is this working? Is this working? Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for attending this session. This research project is part of my thesis at the University of Nottingham, and I also worked on this and got very good feedback at the bank last year as a part of the internship. So the question is very related to what Ivan was presenting. So I study the role of expectations and sectoral heterogeneity in price setting in the UK using firm-level inflation expectations. And so I don't need to motivate why the role of inflation expectations is important, but just to mention some recent papers by Hazel, Nakamura, and Ivan Werning and Catherine Mann. They've been studying the role of inflation expectations as well as the asymmetries across sectors by Andrade and Coibion. And I will frame my analysis using the new Keynesian-Phillips curve. In case you are not familiar with this framework, it's used. It's very common for. It's very used in macroeconomic models and in central banks to study inflation dynamics, and it basically describes how past inflation, expected future inflation, and a measure of real marginal cost or output gap drive the current inflation rate. And this NKPC framework has been mainly studied at the aggregate level, assuming homogeneity across firms and sectors. But if there is heterogeneity across sectors, as I'm going to show evidence with survey data, and you impose homogeneity, you will have an aggregation bias and yield to inconsistent results. So my contribution of this paper contributes to the broad literature of estimations of the new Keynesian-Phillips curve, understanding inflation dynamics, the use of survey data, and heterogeneity in macro. And as I was saying, it's more common to see aggregate estimations of the new Keynesian-Phillips curve using aggregate data. One of the reasons is that it's not common to have firm-level expectations, and in this case, about sectoral inflation, as I will explain in a second. And the literature has found difficult to identify the slope of the Phillips curve, so the effect of the demand shocks on inflation. And it has been suggested by many works to address these identification issues through using firms' expectations, and their papers by Coibion and also Boniva et al. with co-authors have used this same survey data, the CBI. And also there's an interesting paper by Maclay and Tenreiro that they suggest that if you use aggregate data, then upon a successful monetary policy that is offsetting the demand shocks, if the monetary policy is successful and offsets the demand shocks, then you lose the potential identification of these shocks at the aggregate level. But by using regional or sectoral data, as I'm doing, then you will still have real activity shocks that won't be offset by the monetary policy. And this is just to show evidence of this. These are some plots that I made with the CBI survey. These plots are showing heterogeneity in sectoral inflation expectations. I'm plotting services in 2010 compared to firms in the services sector in 2021. So this is just to show that not only there is heterogeneity across sectors within the services group, but so within the services sectors, it's also quite different compared to manufacturing in 2010. And then with this recent high inflation, after this recent high inflation period, expectations shifted to the right for services, but at a much larger rate for manufacturing. So I'm going to use this this evidence of heterogeneity in sectoral expectations to estimate the new Keynesian-Phillips curve. And just to emphasize and not confuse it with the DMP survey, the CBI survey has two main questions on inflation expectations. One is about the own prices, the firm's own prices, which I'm not focusing on, and the one that I'm focusing on is about the sectoral inflation expectations, so how prices changed in the market they compete in. And I'll show the questionnaire with the exact question in a second. So what are my research questions? Is the identification of the new Keynesian-Phillips curve improved by using sectoral data? Can the sectoral heterogeneity be unmasked by using this framework? If so, among which sectors do expectations play a larger role? And then after estimating the sector-specific coefficients through the new Keynesian-Phillips curve, I will study or try to understand what are the main drivers of these sectoral asymmetries. The method that I'm using for the estimation is a dynamic panel with sector-specific coefficients and firm-level survey data on sectoral inflation expectations. Some of the findings that I'll show today are that the new Keynesian-Phillips curve has not disappeared. I'm able to identify a significant coefficient for expectations for past inflation and for the slack measured by sectoral labor costs. And this also comes from the survey. The survey asks the firms how the salary costs have changed in the past 12 months. I'm finding broad heterogeneity across sectors, also that expectations play a larger role in the price-setting behavior of financial services firms compared to manufacturing and to distributive firms and to other services firms. And I also show evidence that firms facing less competition in their sector also give higher importance to their expectations when setting prices. So just a quick overview of the CBI survey, in case it's you're not familiar with it. This is a jointly, this question is jointly asked by the CBI and the Bank of England. The inflation expectations question is conducted jointly and has been completed by firms operating in the UK since 2009. The same firms are being targeted on a quarterly basis, but their completion is voluntary. Firms are being asked not only about their expectations on sectoral prices, but also their perceptions. And with the perceptions, I mean how did the prices change in the past 12 months. They are being asked, as I said before, about their own price, the wage and the sector prices, as well as other firm-level data. And I'm focusing on the sector-level prices. There are 4 surveys, one for manufacturing, one for retail, wholesaling, called distributive, financial services, and services. This is just an overview of the number of reports on expectations that I have per quarter. And I'm not averaging within this period. This is just to show, to give an idea of the number of reports that I have per quarter. And then just to show that one disadvantage is that in the last 2 years, the participation has declined. It's not clear, at least from what I've spoken with the CBI, that it's not clear why the participation has declined. But we're hoping that it gets back. This is just a snapshot of the questions that they are being asked. So this is the main question. What has been the percentage change over the past 12 months in the general level of output prices in the UK markets that your firm competes in? And then regarding expectations, what is expected to occur over the next 12 months and the following 12 months. So you can see that since 2009, these firms have been asked about inflation expectations with the bins from minus 10% to plus 10% in the case of manufacturing, and from minus 5% to 5% for the other service. But they were always able to put other here and just put any number. So that's one advantage. And then, as I said, I'm using the theoretical framework of the new Keynesian-Phillips curve that has been derived at the sector level. So the advantage is that these parameters that I'm estimating, the backward-lookingness on past inflation, forward-lookingness on future inflation expectations, and the slope of the new Keynesian-Phillips curve, everything is at the sector level. Those are the case, and for each quarter. So I have a panel for since 2009 to 2022. And as I was saying, these parameters that I'm estimating, the backward-lookingness and the forward-lookingness, are functions of the underlying deep parameters. That's the backward-lookingness in price setting, the degree of price stickiness, and the discount factor. So for the estimation, I'm doing the mean group estimations with common correlated effects. In case you're not familiar with these estimations, the advantage is that instead of using fixed effects where I just impose a homogeneous parameter on the fixed effects, if I would do so, these common correlated effects account for not only unobservable movement across the sectors, but it allows also to give different loadings to each of the sectors, and then account for that co-movement that could be biasing the errors if we don't control for. And this method also allows me to deal with potential endogeneity of inflation expectations and the slack variable. So this is the main specification where I have the new Keynesian-Phillips curve with direct measures of inflation expectations. And then instead of assuming that this is independent IID, I will use this co-movement or cross-sectional common correlated effects with the factor loadings for each of the sectors. And then I also allow for sector fixed effects. And then regarding the data, for sector specific inflation rates, I'm using the perceived change in sectoral prices. So this is the question that the survey asked about changes in the past 12 months from the CBI. And just to show you that, so the green line is the CBI change in prices for their own sector. This is an average for all the firms in the survey. And the red line is an average of the best mapping that I was able to construct, given that I could also compare it with PPI, sorry. If you compare it with PPI, you will see that it's quite different, but you need to remember that the green line, the changes in prices from the CBI survey, is directed to manufacturing, distributive, services, all firms, so it's not directly comparable to the PPI, so it wouldn't be correct. And then the red line is the best mapping that I was able to build with not only PPI indices, but also CPI and services PPI. And this is just an average. So you can see that it follows quite well the CBI survey question to this average. And then for the right-hand side, for the explanatory variables, I have expectations, as I said, from the CBI. I have lagged inflation, which is the lag of the dependent variable. And then for the slack measure, this literature usually uses either the output gap or real marginal costs. I tried several measures, and I'll show you that the one that worked well and to me it's intuitive that it worked well was the change in salary cost, the real marginal cost. The sample period is quarterly from 2009 to 2022, and I will study the sector-level inflation dynamics at the two-digit SIC, and I'm weighting the firms by the number of employees. This is, so I'm estimating the new Keynesian-Phillips curve for 49 sectors. So I'll have 49 new Keynesian-Phillips curves. This is the number of firms in each of the sectors using the panel. So these are the firms that I'm averaging out for each of the sectors, for each of the periods. And let me go to the results. So let me explain. First, I'm showing these 4 models. What I have is the column 1 and 2. This is just an average estimation of the new Keynesian-Phillips curve. So this is not at the sector level. And you can see that I'm not able to statistically identify the output gap nor the change in salary costs. So the slope is not identified. Here I have 48 quarters. Then the next step that I do is to estimate a pooled fixed effect. And then you can see that I'm able to identify the slope. But you will see that I will be able to reduce the root mean squared error when I add the common correlated effects. So the root mean squared error gets reduced from 1.9 to about 1.5 when I account for both. So the columns 7 and 9, I'm accounting for common correlated effects, which are this unobserved co-movement that I mentioned. And I'm also controlling for endogeneity. So I'm using instrumental variables for columns 7 and 8. And then I'm not able to statistically identify the output gap. This is national level output gap. But I'm able to identify the slope, so the effect of the change in salary cost on sector level inflation rates, and everything is at the sector level. And then I get as the theory predicts and what other evidence has found, which is that the degree of forward-lookingness is larger than the. This is not working. So the degree of forward-lookingness is 0.7, and the degree of backward-lookingness, which is the coefficient on lagged inflation, is 0.09. That's what the literature has found as well, and what the theory predicts if we consider Galli and Girdler the theory. So this suggests that accounting for heterogeneous effects, common correlated effects, and IV improve the estimations. Here what I'm showing is that this method allows me to estimate the sector-specific coefficients. So this is the coefficient on inflation expectations. So this is the role of expectations for each of the sectors. I'm sure you cannot see the names, but the red ones are manufacturing, and then I think in the next one, the distributive are the orange lines, and services are the blue, and financial services the green. And the dashed lines, the vertical dashed lines, are the average for each of the groups. So we can see that the financial services are the ones that have the larger role or give the larger weight to inflation expectations. And these are not very well precise estimations because I don't have a very large time span for each of the sectors to estimate individually. And that's why the next analysis that I will do with these sector-specific coefficients, I will weight these coefficients by the precision of the estimate, by the standard deviation. So this is my second stage analysis. I try to understand what are the main drivers of those asymmetries, of these heterogeneous weights in expectations. And some of the literature has studied that the market concentration, the degree of market concentration could be one of the drivers of how stickiness the sectors are, or how sticky the sectors are, or how much importance they give to expectations. So with US data in 2007, there was this paper that found that market concentration is positively correlated with price stickiness. And the intuition is that the less competition in a sector, the less elastic the demand. And then if everyone in your sector is adjusting prices, then you will lose by not doing it. So you will adjust faster your prices, the more competition there is. So this is one hypothesis that I study. I will construct the Herfindahl Hirschman index, which reflects a degree of concentration in a sector. And then other industry level characteristics that I study were coal over cost, so the cost structure of the sector, and also the share of imports, the labor share, and the unit labor cost variability. And as I was saying, given that I use the estimated sector-specific parameters from the NKPC, which are not as precise, I will use weighted least squares to account for the various degrees of precision of the estimates. And yeah, for the Herfindahl Hirschman index, I use CBI turnover data. So this is what I found. I found a positive relationship between the degree of concentration measured by the Herfindahl index. So this is telling me that the more concentrated the sector, the more weight they will give to inflation expectations. And then I also found that the share of imports are also positively correlated, which might suggest that perhaps the exposure to the currency, to the foreign currency, drives these firms or sectors to be more forward-looking. And with being more forward-looking, what I mean is to actually form their expectations and give importance to their expectations when they're setting prices. And intuitively, in terms of market concentration, the intuition that I had in mind was that, or perhaps I'm basing my intuition on what Ivan Werning was suggesting, which is that if you are in a sector that is very competitive, you will try to adjust your prices faster to follow your competitors, and then you will be less worried about forming your own expectations and your own model. And then what ends up happening is that if you are concerned about losing out or missing out in the future because you haven't adjusted your prices, you might overshoot your price to offset or compensate for potential losses of changes that you didn't foresee. So those are my findings. Just to conclude, the relationship between labor cost and inflation at the sector level is positive and statistically significant. The identification is obtained by exploiting the cross-sectional data and using direct measures of firms' expectations. Evidence suggests broad heterogeneity across sectors. Expectations play a larger role in the price-setting behavior of financial firms compared to other services. Firms facing less competition in their sector also give higher importance to their expectations when setting prices. The share of imports is also positively correlated to the role of expectations. And this information can be used for policy purposes, as the monetary policy can affect inflation through the management of inflation expectations, and as a better identified and heterogeneous New-Keynesian-Phillips curve might change the monetary policy response. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Just a question on the usefulness now of the new Keynesian Phillips curve, especially if you're finding weights of around 0.8 on inflation expectations. That might be useful when we could argue inflation expectations were roughly anchored on central bank targets, and for much of the sample that seemed to be the case. But I mean, it looks like over the last couple of years, central banks have dropped the ball, and inflation expectations are well away from targets. So I guess it then begs the question: what's driving inflation expectations? And I mean, is that something you've thought about?
Yeah, so I guess the way I was framing it was whether the weight of inflation expectations in the price setting could be explained by the drivers that I was suggesting, such as the degree of concentration or the cost structure of the sectors. But I haven't studied what drives. So I guess that I would frame it a different way. That I guess it's like, how do they form their expectations? I think might be what you are suggesting, if I got it. Because that's something that I'm working on in parallel. There are ways of testing how firms form expectations, and that usually is related, I think what Ivan was mentioning as well, whether they pay more attention at certain periods or less attention, and then how do they build their information sets, and that would inform what are the drivers of their expectations based on what is the information that they care about. And yeah, but that's an interesting point. Thank you.
Thanks for the really great presentation. On the firm characteristics, have you tried also checking for the size of the firm, since market concentration and the share of exports might reflect firms that are larger, and maybe that therefore also have put more resources into forming the expectations, understanding inflation?
Yes, that's something that we can do in our project, but I cannot do here because this is at the sector level. So this is so then I don't think that I could find that a sector has usually larger firms than other sectors, because that at the sector level that would be the way to say it could happen. Yeah, that financial firms perhaps is more disaggregated and there are more firms. I don't think so. That there could be a way to characterize a sector in terms of the size of the firms in that sector, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I see at the firm level that would be clearer.
At the firm level.
Maybe you can check just for the sectors, like other sectors that are dominated by some larger firms, that you could look at that.
But that's the degree of concentration, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if I have the television, the media sector that has 5 big firms leading, so that's the size of the sector. I mean, that's the size of the firms in that sector, and I'm just capturing through the Herfindahl index with the turnover, not the number of employees, but with the turnover data. I think I'm capturing the size.
Yeah, exactly. But then it becomes the question from the intuition: is this more because a competitiveness issue, or the fact that they have a lot of market power, or is it that they are larger and more informed?
Yes, that's true. That's a good point. Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Ray Lyden, Central Bank of Ireland. Interesting paper. A bit like the first question, and maybe you can't do it with the data I have, but if you looked at regime dependence, so your pass-through of labour costs looks about what it is in the literature. But do you have periods of high inflation? You know, there's a lot of papers that show that that's higher when level of inflation is higher. So are you able to look at that? Maybe not in the period you have.
So to see the relevance of labor cost in different periods, in low inflation periods versus high. Yes, that I could do that. I haven't done it. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session. And thank you so much to the organizers for making this conference possible. Today, I will present a joint work with Nikoleta, Anesti, and Vanya Sadi from the Bank of England. Therefore, the usual disclaimer applies. This paper is about UK households' inflation experience and how that matters in the way they form their expectations. Before I start, this is an ongoing project, so I'm very happy to take any kind of suggestions and comments along the way. During the last decades, we have largely understood the importance of inflation expectations for the transmission of monetary policy. Now, most of the early literature focused on aggregate levels of inflation expectations, namely looking at the median of survey of professional forecasters, or even looking at the cross-section, but the median levels of households and firms as you heard about before. Now, one of the interesting findings of this, now in the more recent literature, we have tried to exploit this rich heterogeneity in the cross-sections. We have tried to see how different households form their expectations in a different way and try to understand what are the factors that actually matter in the way they form their expectations. One of the interesting findings is this seminar paper by Malman, Deere, and Nagel, which finds that households that experience or live through a period of high volatility of prices or high inflation end up having on average higher inflation expectations compared to households who never experience a two-digit inflation rate. Another interesting finding from a very recent paper by Michael Weber and co-authors is that if you look at different categories, the sum of these individual categories exceeds the value of the category itself. So this just highlights the importance of looking at the different categories of expenditure for households, as it might represent different consumption patterns and matter differently in terms of the weights they put to different categories to form their expectations. Now, what is this paper about? This paper is interested in the inflation rate experience to correctly represent the true cost of living of different households. So we aim to correctly identify the inflation rate of these different households and look at how different categories of prices weigh differently in the way they form their expectations. Let me just give you the big picture of what we do here. We mainly use two big data sets, the two big micro-level data sets. One, on the one hand side, we have the living cost of food and survey, the LCFS, and on the other one, we have the inflation attitude survey from the Bank of England. Now, on the first stage, or the first section of this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on the inflation, or uniquely on the inflation attitudes, and I'm going to show you some results uniquely using inflation attitudes. And later on, we're going to move into combining these two data sets. And the reason why we do this is because, on the one hand, on the inflation attitude side, we have rich information about inflation expectations and some sociodemographics, but we don't have information about expenditure, so the composition of total expenditure of households. Now, on the LCFS side, we have rich information on the sociodemographics and the composition of the total expenditure, but we don't have information about their inflation expectations. So we aim to combine these two information to have the bigger picture and see how accounting for the differences in consumption, so the composition of different the composition of their total expenditure matters differently depending on the characteristics of the household. Now, in order to do that, we need to identify households, and we do so by using a set of characteristics. I'm going to go in more detail on that later on. And with this, we can construct the consumption the cohort-specific, cohort in terms of the age, so cohort-specific consumption baskets, and see how they differ depending on the age groups. Why is this important? Well, we know that so inflation varies across different baskets. And we have goods that have higher inflation in certain periods and goods that do not experience so much volatility in prices. And therefore, if you consume differently, then you're exposed to different inflation rates. And this is important to make this distinction between you are exposed to different inflation rates compared to you perceived a higher inflation or lower inflation. We want to identify exposure and try to move away of what you perceive as a high or low inflation. And therefore, we also control for demographics in that sense. Well, this is just to show you that it's a very, at least in the inflation experience literature, it's a very active and new area of the literature. But when we look at the literature for the UK in terms of inflation expectations and inflation experiences, this is not so much the case. We don't have that much literature for the case of the UK, and one of the papers is going to be presented after me. So just setting the ground there for setting the expectations quite high. And just to mention, we follow this this literature in the creation of the synthetic data set in the way we merge these two big data sets. Overall, so what I plot here is the 1 year ahead inflation expectations for different age cohorts, so for households of different age groups. And what we observe is that even disaggregating by 6 age groups, we don't see that much of heterogeneity. We see that in the whole cross-section, but if you take the mean levels or the median levels, we do not observe such a big difference. In this case, we observe a 0.5 percentage point difference, which might lead to think that there's not that much heterogeneity in the cross-sections of different households. However, when we start disaggregating this and observing this with in more detail, so in this case I plot the same age groups, but I look at what happens if I also take into account their house tenure, whether they're renters, they have a mortgage, or they already have their own house. This difference widens, and now we have over a 1 percentage point difference between the households that have lower inflation rates, lower inflation expectations, compared to households who have potentially higher inflation expectations. I've been talking about different consumption baskets, and I've been talking about different inflation rates, but I haven't talked about which categories I'm talking about and which ones are we following. And in this case, we're going to follow the COICUP classification. So this is going to sum up to 1, to the total consumption. To total consumptions, and the groups are food and non-alcoholic beverages, alcohol, clothing, housing. Housing, I will come back to that in a second because it potentially can be misleading. There are more things in the housing category than just rent or house bills, and this can have some confounding effects there. So this is something that we're currently working on. So you just want to bring your attention to that right away before someone raises their hand. Furnishing, health, transport, communication, recreation and culture, education, restaurants and hotels, and miscellaneous goods and services. Okay, so as I said in the first section, we're going to look at just the inflation attitude survey. So what we do here is we want to capture the weights different CPIs or different categories have for agents' inflation expectations. So in this case, we disaggregate these 12 categories, and we try to observe how much do they differ in terms of the weight they have for households' inflation expectations. So we also control for a set of demographics, which are their work status, the ONS social grade classification, education level, and a few more. And as I said, the CPI is the COICUP categories I just mentioned, and they all sum to 12. The I in this case are the households, the different age cohorts of households. So households, the young to 60 plus households. I could potentially bore you with a bunch of regressions, but what I want to show you here is the actual coefficients of each of these age groups. So in this case, I'm showing you the weights different categories have on the inflation expectations of different age group households. So you can see on the top left, we have the food category. We see that the food category has a relatively small effect on the first age group, and it grows to having a stronger effect for older households. Clothing has a very small effect for the age group, so the young age group 1. It has the strongest effect on age group 2 and 3, and it slowly decays and with older households. Now, as I mentioned before, housing gives us negative results, which is kind of counterintuitive, and we're currently trying to properly define what we want to capture as housing. And then transport also has some small effects on young households, and it increases in the middle and older households. In here, I show you the effects of controls, or the social demographics. We see that in this case, the upper left is work status. So these are the effects of it has to be unemployed compared to being employed. So unemployed households tend to have higher inflation expectations. And this goes in line with the literature. And you can see that it doesn't have an effect on young households below 25 years old, which is explained by the fact that usually most of these households are studying and they're not in the work. So you have very few data in that point. With respect to the social grades, the ONS social grades, this is with respect to the professional category. So lower skilled jobs tend to have a higher inflation expectation compared to more professional jobs. Education doesn't have a straightforward result, but you can see that house tenure, being a mortgager or a renter leads to having higher inflation expectations compared to having your own home. Now, this is all good, but we're not taking into account the fact that different households potentially have different composition of their total expenditure. So what I want to highlight here is that if you have a household, let's say a young household, and you compare that household to, 50-year-old household, the composition of the total share, the composition of their total expenditure they spent on food and transport differs significantly. So they have different compositions of the way they spend their total expenditure. So we want to correctly identify the shares, the composition of the total expenditure, and account for that, and therefore capture their corresponding inflation rate. And what we observe in the data is that there is substantial differences in the composition of their total expenditure. In this case, I showed the share of total expenditure that different age cohorts spend on food and the food category. And we observed that for certain groups, the mass of this distribution is concentrated closer to the mean, and it's quite densely concentrated around the median. But we see some differences, significant differences when you look into different age cohorts. And more than the median effect, we see huge dispersions in different age groups. In terms of the construction of the data set, our goal is to identify households that share comparable characteristics. So we want to identify households based on characteristics that make them similar. So we consider socio-demographic variables that are present in both of these data sets, the LCFS and the inflation attitudes, as potential matching mechanisms. These characteristics are age, employment status, region, house tenure, and gender. And we evaluate the importance of these characteristics in terms of the explanatory power they have in explaining the heterogeneity in the inflation expectations. Based on these characteristics, then we obtain the mean values of these groups as representative households to be able to merge these two data sets. to give you a clear idea of how we do that, we use statistical matching techniques that integrate data from two surveys referred to the same target population in the case in which one of the variables is present in both surveys, but we aim to observe data that is not jointly present in both surveys. So in this case, if you have sample A, which has X and Y, you have sample B that has X, but it has Z. We want to construct this data set, synthetic data set that allows us to see X, Y, and Z. Y and Z are collected through different sample draws from the same target population. X variables are collected in both samples, and they are correlated with both with Y and with Z. So with both of these other variables in both samples, or in both surveys in this case. And we use these common variables as a way to impute the specific variables only observed in one of these data sets. In terms of the characteristics that I just mentioned, we find that age, work status, and house tenure seem to have the highest explanatory power. As a sanity check, this is the overview of our constructed or our synthetic panel, our synthetic data set, which controls for for the 6 age groups for renters, mortgagers, and house owners, work status, and the data set runs from 2002 until 2020. And you can observe that we see some heterogeneity within these different households, but we also don't see any kind of like crazy points that get really far away from the overall mean. Now we go back to the same kind of idea. We want to capture the effects different categories, in this case different inflation rates, have on the inflation expectations of different households. What are these different households? In this case, these different households are the age groups. And we do that one year ahead. So we want to see the inflation, 1 year ahead inflation rates. And in this case, we look also, just as a reminder, we see the same inflation rates categories as I mentioned before, the COIC up, so these 12 categories. Again, I can confuse you all with a bunch of numbers from the regression tables. This is just to show you more or less what we do in our results, but let's go back again to the same image as a matter of comparison, and let's look at the effects. Now, what we observe now in the food category is that overall, now the way we account for the share, overall the effect is significantly higher in terms of what the weight it has on households' inflation expectations, and it has a particularly strong effect for the household, for the age group number 4. For the clothing, one of the groups stands out, and it's one of the young groups, so it's age group number 2. Housing still has the same problem, even after correcting for the share, still has this very close to 0 or a negative coefficients. And we see that for transport, the first and last age group, so the young and the retired 60 plus age group, have a low effect compared to the rest of the age groups. This is to show you that we are going in the direction of age groups because we see that this is quite important in differentiating different households. But this is not the only way we can go. We can also go in identifying households in the direction of their house tenure. So instead of saying we have 6 different households based on their house tenure, based on their age group, we can do the same but looking into whether they're renters, mortgagers, or house owners. And I plot here the same coefficients. These are the coefficients or the weights the food category or the food inflation rate has on the inflation expectations of renters, mortgagers, and owners. What is interesting to see here is that once we start doing that, we see some categories that have a very strong effect. And this leads to this literature that mentions over-responsiveness of certain categories of inflation in the way agents, or in this case households, form their inflation expectations. And yeah, you see also some substantial differences also in the transport category, where mortgagers tend to have the strongest, or it tends to have the strongest effect for mortgagers in the way they form their expectations. Yeah. To wrap it up, this paper is looking to understand inflation rate experience through expenditure patterns of different cohorts that affect their inflation expectations formation process. So we aim to identify these households' specific inflation rates and see how different consumption categories or inflation categories affect the way they form their expectations. To do so, we create a synthetic panel by combining two macro level data sets on households' expenditure with the CPI data. And our early findings indicate that various basket classification carry distinct influences on individuals' inflation rates when accounting for age cohorts and also when accounting for their house tenure. Thank you.
Question. Your sample from the charts ends in 2020. I mean, arguably, that's just when things got interesting. So on average, inflation was about 2%. I mean, there could be a lot of information because everything's moving around much more and you get much more possibilities in identifying different coefficients. So why did you stop? Have you just not got the data, or does it mess up your
No, we just didn't have the data available at that point. We're currently working on rolling and extending this data set on to the, to present. Just remember that, these were surveys and we had COVID, so there was a bit of a problem there in terms of availability of the data. So the reason, there's nothing we're trying to hide, there's just not the data available in the same form we have it until 2020.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just interested because you looked across by age ranges. Is there any sort of potential to look at it through sort of household salary, and if not maybe a proxy such as sort of occupation? So I imagine sort of like the lower household salaries have a lot of different inflation expectation due to changes in food price of food recently, compared to say just by an age range, vary quite a bit.
Okay, definitely one of these early results, we use income as an explanatory variable. However, we cannot use income as a way of matching this household because income is defined differently in both households. So yeah, potentially it's a good way of matching these households. However, in terms of merging these two data sets, is not possible. We can still use that as an explanatory an explanatory variable. We might guess what the coefficient would look like. The higher your income, the lower your inflation expectations, but yeah, definitely, absolutely. Yeah. Good.
Hi, Ray Lyden, Central Bank of Ireland. So, as a I understand the descriptive part of why this is interesting, but as a policymaker, what I would be really interested in is the dynamics of expectation adjustment. So, are you able to look at, when there's a particularly significant shock, maybe to a significant component, how the dynamics of expectations change? So, do they jump up and stay up for a while, or do they? And then when that component of inflation falls back, do they fall back very quickly? So that would be really interesting right now because Bank of England, the ECB, they care about how, why do we care about expectations? It's how do they feed into other variables that feed inflation in the future? So digging deeper into the dynamics, I think, would be really interesting for the policymaker. And it goes a bit to the first question as well about the current period.
Yeah. That's actually a very good comment. We haven't looked into dynamics, so we haven't shocked anything in that case? Yeah, absolutely, yes. I think that's actually very interesting.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Thanks. So anyway, thanks a lot for letting me present my work on individual experiences and inflation expectations, and thanks also to Gabriel for setting the stage for my presentation. So I'm Dario Bonciani from the Bank of England, and this is joint work with Riccardo Masolo and Silvia Sarpietro. And before I start, I have to mention that the usual disclaimer applies. So obviously, anchoring inflation expectations is very key for the monetary policy transmission. And there is significant evidence also that individual experiences are important in shaping expectations about economic variables. In this paper, in this work, we try to understand, first of all, how different experiences shape their inflation expectations, households' inflation expectations, and what are the implications for monetary policy. Before I start, just as background, central banks around the world, I mean, not particularly now that energy prices, because of the cost of living crisis, but before that, I mean, central banks often looked at measures of core inflation, stripping out food and energy prices. And this is done usually for two main arguments, I think. So one is a statistical argument. Core inflation tends to be a better predictor of overall inflation than lagged overall inflation. And there are also some supply considerations in the sense that food and energy prices tend to be very flexible and very volatile. And as a result, monetary policy, there is not much scope for monetary policy to affect this kind of prices. There is relatively recent literature like that is ever growing, like for example by Koibion and co-authors, or Berg 2008, that shows that inflation expectations of consumers are very sensitive to food and energy prices. And therefore, as also suggested, for example, by D'Acunto and co-authors, monetary policy should pay close attention to food and energy prices and not just focus on core inflation necessarily. So in our paper, we think we can contribute to this debate along two dimensions. First of all, we use one of the same data sets that from the previous paper, that is this Bank of England Inflation Attitude Survey, in order to study how attaching importance to food and energy prices affects the relationship between perceptions about current inflation and expectations about future inflation. And what we're currently working on is also building a model, so a DSG model, in which different agents attach different weights to food and energy prices in order to study the impact of policy targeting different measures of inflation. So in terms of related literature, this paper and this work is related to a vast and growing literature, fast-growing literature. There are papers that are on how dealing with how experiences shape inflation perceptions. For example, Malmandir and Nagel, Cavallo and co-author, Axelrod and co-authors. There is a relatively recent strand also that uses surveys not just to gauge, to obtain measures of expectations, but also to gauge information about agents' economic behavior. And then there is this very related paper by D'Acunto and co-authors using Nielsen scanner data that studies the importance of grocery shopping prices on inflation expectations. So we use, as I mentioned, the Bank of England Inflation Attitude Survey that explicitly asks individuals which experiences were important for their perception about overall current inflation. So the key benefit of this survey is that we do not need to infer the importance of food and energy prices from the weight in the consumption bundle, or from the shopping frequency, because respondents are directly asked about this question. So just to give you an understanding a little bit of the data that we use. So first of all, we use 4 waves of this survey. So the 2008 Q1, 2010 Q1, 2011 Q1, and 2013 Q1. And the only reason why we use this specific vintages of the survey is that they ask this specific question. When you said that prices had changed in the past 12 months, how important were the following things in getting to that answer? Your personal experience of the change in the price of food and drink, clothing and footwear, transport including the cost of petrol, household energy, housing, inflation in the media, VAT changes in the media, or other factors. So we refer to these price categories like food and drink and clothing and footwear as experiences. So respondents, for each experience, respondents can attach 4 different levels of importance. They can say that they consider, for example, food to be very important, to be just important, not very important, or not important at all. And then, on top of that, the data gives us also information. This data set also gives us information about respondents' inflation perception, which means the perception that individuals have about the evolution of prices over the last 12 months. And it gives us also the expectation about the evolution of, about the future evolution of prices over 1 year and 2 year horizons. We also have data about personal characteristics such as employment status, gender, age, class, education, region, and housing status. And last, we also have data on income, but it has many missing observations, so in our analysis we exclude it from our regressions. So just to give you a sense about the heterogeneity in inflation experiences, in this chart, I plot the share of people that respond that a certain experience is at least very important. So it's either important or very important. And I do so conditional on gender and conditioning on education. So what we can see is, first of all, that food and energy price, both food, the blue bar, and energy, housing energy, so the orange bar, are considered important by a significant share of the population. So over 80% of the population considers it important, either important or very important. This is both for men and women, and but it also declines slightly with education. On the other hand, the media, so the share of people that say that media is important informing their perception is significantly lower, and but it grows with education. So then, in order to get a bit more of a sense of the heterogeneity in inflation experiences, we, in a more rigorous manner, we conduct then a set of order probit regressions, where we regress the inflation experience onto the individual characteristics. So the order probit regression is a methodology that generalizes the more standard probit regression, allowing the left-hand side variable for more to allow them for more than 2 values, to take more than 2 values. And in terms of results, what we find is that, for example, older and less educated respondents tend to be more likely to say that food is very important. Older people or unemployed workers are associated with a significantly lower probability of considering transport important. Female respondents are more likely to consider energy prices important, and higher education and class reduce the probability of food and clothing prices being important. So coming to the main empirical specification. So in this case, we try to understand, first of all, how inflation expectations are related to inflation perception, so expectation about future inflation, how this is related to the perception about current inflation. And on top of that, we try to understand whether individuals that consider a certain category, a certain experience to be very important, have a different association between the perception and the expectation about future inflation. So what we do is we regress the individual inflation expectation onto realized inflation, so we control for realized inflation. The perception about the individual perception about current inflation, a set of controls, and a set of interaction terms between the individual perception about current inflation and a dummy variable that says that is equal to 1 if the individual considers a certain experience to be very important. Controls, in this set of controls, we include all the individual characteristics that we mentioned before, as well as also the categorical answers to the various experiences. In the next slide, I will only report now the results for 1 year expectations, ahead expectations, but we also have results for the 2 years ahead expectations. So coming to the results, first of all, what we note is that even controlling for realized inflation, there is a very strong and significant association on average between the expectation, 1 year ahead expectation, and the perception about current inflation. So we didn't interpret that as saying the basic. In our paper, we say that we use the terminology that there is a significant degree of stickiness in inflation expectations. When we add the interaction term between perception and food, we notice also that individuals that say that food is very important, they tend to have even stickier inflation expectations. So they tend to have a stronger association between the perception and the expectation. When we add all the interaction terms, what we notice is that we have a similar story also for clothing and for household energy, although these are less statistically significant. While instead, the interaction between individuals that say that media is very important, they tend to have a smaller association between perception and expectation, meaning they tend to have apparently less sticky inflation expectations. We do then 2 more additional empirical exercises. In the first exercise, what I didn't mention before, but what I should have mentioned is that the data that we have is not a panel data, but these are this is a repeated cross-section. And so in this exercise now, we also try to further control for potential unobserved heterogeneity. And we do so by using a pseudo-panel methodology by Lewis, Melkanji, and Pilosov. And we find that our results, even controlling for this unobserved individual characteristic, go through. The last empirical exercise that we run is on the forecasting ability. So what we ask is basically, what we want to test is whether individuals that say that food is more or less important, whether these are worse or better at predicting inflation. So and what we find, so therefore we run the following regression. We regress the individual forecast errors. So we compare the expectation to realize the future inflation. we regress this squared forecast errors to the experiences. And in this case, we don't use a dummy saying that that is equal to 1 if the experience is very important. We actually include the variable 1 to 4. So if it's very important, if it's important, not important, or not important at all. And what we find is that individuals that, so increasing, so if food, energy, or transport, or clothing are considered more important, then the bias increases. So individuals that tend to have, say that food is very important, tend to have large forecast errors. Same for energy. When individuals instead rely more on media, they tend to have a lower bias, so lower forecast errors. So I was quite quick, I think, but I was also helped by the previous presentation. So I mean, we use a survey in which respondents tell us directly what matters for the formation of their inflation perceptions. Agents attach a lot of importance to food and energy prices while forming their inflation perceptions. They tend to display a significantly larger degree of association between their perception about current inflation and their expectations about future inflation. So they tend to have stickier inflation expectations. And what we also showed is that while food and energy prices tend to be very volatile, they can have therefore long-lasting effects on expectations of a very large share of the population. And therefore, central banks probably should try hard also to reach out to these people. And not that many people rely heavily on media, on the conventional media. So the central banks probably should try to reach out to this large share of the population via more unconventional tools, let's say, unconventional media. So we are now currently in the process of developing a DSG model, as I mentioned. So it's going to be a heterogeneous agents model, and where individuals will attach different weight to different goods categories. And then we will try to draw from that some monetary policy implications. Yeah, I hope we'll have a draft soon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Robert Hill. I was just wondering, I wasn't paying attention properly at the very beginning when you're looking at the different components, but do you have were you asking at all about housing rents and house prices, how those might affect expectations of inflation?
So it does have a variable housing, right? I mean, so mortgage payments, yeah.
Okay, so that was more based on mortgage payments, that?
Yeah.
So not
rent.
the rents.
Also
not
includes
the prices.
rent. Yeah. So
it includes rents as well. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. I found that really interesting. But again, this question about what's happening recently, and I wonder if this could be part of the story. So a comment is, maybe what happened, there was a simultaneous recovery in the world because everybody's vaccination programs worked, and there was this unprecedented global synchronized recovery that put huge pressure on energy and commodity prices. And then Ukraine added a twist to that. So we saw this global surge in inflation, and I guess the puzzle then is, why inflation is sort of got stuck and hasn't come down. And this could be part of the answer, right? That expectations are particularly influenced by the components which were most hard hit, where if you like, the initial shock was. So a couple of questions follow from that. Have you thought about applying it to the current situation? And have you thought about applying this framework? Mm-hmm. And I guess my other question, I wasn't familiar with the literature you were citing. Is that UK focused, or is that?
Yeah, sorry. This is UK households. Yeah. And yeah, unfortunately, I mean, we would have loved to have data also for more recent quarters. Unfortunately, I mean, this question was asked very infrequently, and actually it stopped in 2013. So yeah, in more normal times probably than now. And yeah, I don't have a good answer for the first question, but it's yeah, it's a very good point, I think. Yeah.
Well, I have a question about the data.
Yeah.
You included not labor market status, employment status, I think.
Yeah.
What categories are these? Is it employed and unemployed, or is it any other categories?
I mean, maybe you guys also can correct me, but I think if I remember correctly, it was there's also self-employed, and so it's a bit more detailed also than just I mean, there is unemployed, employed, and there is also self-employed. Yeah. Just employed and unemployed? Okay, then it's just employed and unemployed. Okay.
Jeremy, Ray, again, really interesting. Kind of bringing the last two presentations together, I was wondering your sense as to sort of, so food and drink and energy are the most important ones. Do you think that's because basically they're key components of people's consumption basket? Or do you think it's because they're the most volatile components, and therefore in a kind of inattention world, you know, we can't pay attention to everything, so you might as well pay attention to the ones that are most volatile?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think that, so on the one hand, I think it's these are the most salient prices that we observe on a daily basis. So I think people do pay a lot of attention to those. And so you go grocery shopping a bunch of times a week. We put petrol, or we pay the bills every now and relatively frequently. So, and these are also things that are very hard to substitute from, right? I mean, so I think these are, yeah, makes it, yeah, probably, yeah, this why people put a disproportionate amount of attention to this kind of prices.
Can I ask one? If you go to the first set of results, is this not working? Oh, you've got. Do you have an intuition when you keep adding the interaction terms of perception with the different categories? Do you have an intuition on the negative sign of the coefficients? Obviously, some of them are not statistically significant, but what would be your interpretation?
Like media, or?
Yeah, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I interpret this, as a sign that, of probably that we are away. I mean, there are, how to say, these individuals probably are more rational. I mean, I don't know, to some extent more. I mean, if they're better informed, then they're closer to rational expectations, and therefore, while instead the other ones, I think these are, this could be interpreted to some extent also deviations from rational expectations, I think it is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, cheers. Oh, you have a question?
Yeah.
We have time.
Hi, thanks. No, I was wondering, the stronger correlation, for example, with food prices could be because food prices are more persistent in the data. So that's why people who see food prices as important, and that's something you could check, for example, if you look at food price inflation, is that more persistent than transport price inflation?
Mm-hmm.
And that could explain why the correlation is stronger between perceptions and expectations.
That's a good point, yeah. Thanks. All right, thank you very much.